All right. Here we are on day number 2 of the Jonathan Edwards trip that I was able to take. Video number 1, hopefully you were able to see that, an introduction to how I got into Edwards and things, and how the trip came about. And then the second video, which would actually be day 1 of the Edwards trip, which covered Monday, October 30th, that mainly surrounded Enfield, Weathersfield, East Windsor, where Jonathan Edwards was born, where his parents died and were buried, where Timothy Edwards pastored, and where Jonathan Edwards would have went to church up until he went away to school. And so that revolved around Monday. Well, Tuesday, because of the now this isn't chronological in the life of Jonathan Edwards, but the way people I met during the week, Wednesday and Friday, thought it would best that Tuesday would be spent in Stockbridge. Now, Stockbridge is where Jonathan Edwards spent the latter part of his life. He grew up there in East Windsor, went to school at Yale down in New Haven, had a short stint in New York City, was a pastor there, also signed an agreement to be a pastor in Bolton, found himself back at Yale as a tutor. I believe I've got that timeline correct. And then Grandpa passes away in Northampton on his mother's side, and so Jonathan Edwards ends up in Northampton, where he spent a little over 20 years, almost 2.5 decades. Well, after his church voted him out, we'll get to that more on the next video, because that's where I spent Wednesday in Northampton. But after the church voted him out, I believe that was June or July 22nd, 1750. Um, I think June 22nd, 1750 is when the church voted, we're done with you, by a ratio of 230 in favor of him leaving and 23 staying. So roughly 10 to 1, 10 to 1 wanted him out of there. Well, a little bit of time passes at Northampton, and he ends up finding himself at Stockbridge. All right, so what we've got here is the marker for where Jonathan Edwards' home would have been. I'll show you a video clip shortly of the mission house where John Sargent would have lived, which actually is in a different location to where it once stood. Someone told me, a lady who worked there at the home and with the government, like a historical society type deal. And so Edwards, instead of living there in the home where Sargent lived and where Sargent died, I don't know if his family stayed in the home or what, but Edwards did not live in the mission house. He lived in his own home, which is where this sundial marks that. So it says this ground was built on this ground was built the house occupied by Jonathan Edwards, August of 1752 to January 1758. And in January 1758 is when he left for Princeton, the College of New Jersey. Another angle at the marker, you can see there, and you're looking towards the main road. Let me zoom in on this for you. Here you are, and we're looking that way. The map would have it the other way. You can see Main Street that runs there through Stockbridge. Very, very small town. It reminds me of a small town in our area called Belton, South Carolina, where Edwards spent at Northampton. I would think of that as the big. Boston would be the huge city in Edwards' day. Northampton would be the medium-sized city, and Stockbridge would be, the little town with one convenience store and maybe one red light, if that, and maybe a little shop here or there. So Stockbridge, very small in Edwards' day, very small in this day, although today it's more of an upscale retirement type place from what I gather. Very, very expensive homes. So here's the marker. One of these is a video. Yeah, see if I can give you an.
Hello, here we are in a
few more books. Sundial right here marks where was built the house occupied by Jonathan Edwards from August 1752 to January 1758. And then, if you look over here on the back side, we have the verse from Job chapter 1 that says Job was a perfect and upright man, one that feared God and escheweth evil. All right. And side note, doesn't really pertain to Edwards. Even though the trip was scheduled as quickly as it was, and I didn't have a lot of time to prepare, and I definitely wasn't going to try to do it during the winter. Our winters in South Carolina could no way compare to the winters up there. It just ended up being a beautiful time. You see the trees there and the colors of the leaves. So very, very beautiful. And I took my time in Stockbridge. I knew there wasn't going to be anything else that day. Tuesday was dedicated solely to that. So it took a lot of time. Just kind of didn't leave my car or didn't move my car in place as I went. Just left it parked there in one spot and just kind of enjoyed the fresh air. Don't get to do that, really any at home. So just that part was nice. At the library in Stockbridge, they have a lot of stuff. Not doesn't compare with the Beinecke at Yale that we'll get to on the Friday video. But for what it was, man, I stayed there literally almost all day, and you could go there and do research and stuff for a long time. So in this one bookshelf, they had a lot of things dedicated to Edwards. You can see a majority of his works, from Yale. There's several $1,000s on that bottom shelf right there. Yeah, so pretty almost the whole set, minus a couple more on the end. So very expensive books sit there. I hope people read them, realize what they have. On that second shelf, you have what is the the 8-volume set of Edwards, which I've seen on eBay a few times. And then there on the left, one of them is in the white box. You have the 4-volume set of the works of Edwards. And then on that top shelf, you have a lot of books about Edwards. You've got Marston's biography there, the black with the gray spine, and then several others there. There's actually on the far right, I mentioned it in the introduction. What got me kind of hooked on Edwards was John Piper's book, God's Passion for His Glory, which is Piper's intro to Edwards, and then the latter half of the book, the text and his comments on a dissertation concerning the end for which God created the world. That book kind of started it all for me. You can kind of see in the background, there's a lady working at the desk. Was able to talk to her a little bit, and then the guy who came in and worked the evening shift, a history teacher or a school teacher there in the school nearby, able to talk with him quite a good bit, and was able to share. Obviously, they know about Edwards working there, and in some things that they knew a lot that I didn't know, and then other areas I was able to share some things with them that they were not familiar with. The lady in particular here, she was familiar with the sinners in the hands of an angry God sermon. But one thing that I kind of shared with her, I said, you don't really hear this a lot if that's all you've read. Imagine from what you read in school about sinners, the sinner's sermon. The flip side of that on heaven would be, some people would say, his message, Heaven, a World of Love, which was the final sermon in a series. I have read that. I have not read the rest of that series. But in a series that he preached on 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the charity chapter or the love chapter, Edwards preached through that chapter, and the last message was Heaven, a World of Love, which I actually printed out and read here in my little wood building last year, or maybe 2 years ago. And so I shared with the lady there. I said, you're familiar with sinners. Let me tell you another place that you can start and read about the love of God. So I told her, I said, it's actually here in this book down here on Ethical Writings, I believe is the Yale volume. And I opened it up and I put the bookmark in there, and I said, maybe, sitting here in the library, maybe one day you'll be able to read that. So a lot of books there. You can look through a lot of old books on that second shelf as well. Here is a card that sits atop the actual, not the replica that we saw at Wethersfield, but the actual rotating desk that Jonathan Edwards used. I'm sure that Edwards did not just have tons and tons and tons of money to spend, but also I'm sure back then they probably put more effort into building nice furniture than they did today. I don't know. But obviously, it's not what most of my furniture is made out of, particle board. This was actually real stuff, and I didn't spin it all the way around. I did kind of wiggle it a little bit and looked up under it, but very nice. Had some embellishments on it with the decoration there, there at the bottom. So very nice. Edwards, I'm sure he lived as a simple man, I would guess. Haven't seen anything to suggest otherwise too much, but like many preachers, what they use for reading and studying gets some attention to detail, and it seems to have been the case with Edwards as well. Today we can just open up a browser with 6 tabs or 6 windows. He didn't have browsers or tabs or windows, but he had books and manuscripts and papers and quill pens and such. And so he could put his 6 books or 6 works and spin them around and rotate and compare. So that was an actual Edwards artifact there. A replica of the Badger portrait, which once I was able to see the only one, the original one, I'd say this is a nearly perfect representation of that. So that look and that face and that portrait, if you've seen pictures of Edwards, that's what they're going off of right there. They had a few little tidbits about that. Here was the actual first writing of Edwards I was able to see during the week. I'll see a whole lot more at the end of the week, but this was the first thing I saw that was actually from the hand of Jonathan himself. One of his commentaries that he owned, Jonathan Edwards' book, 1751, Life of Brainerd, which sold more than his other works. Mr. Brainerd, who died in the house of Edwards, October 9th, 1747. We'll see more about that later. Religious Affections, Volume 2 of the works of Jonathan Edwards. If you've never read that, read that. Read it slowly. Pray when you read it. Pray that the Lord doesn't pour. Well, I shouldn't say it like that. Pray that you can get through it without extreme doubt and suffering. But then a page or two later, you may read, and tears come down your face with grace and assurance. It's just one of those books that really hits you. This right here, I've actually thought about contacting the Stockbridge Library and Museum again, seeing if they can send me some photocopy of these pages. This was very interesting because of the Edwards portraits. There's only one set of the Edwards portraits that are known as authentic and real, and the original. They're not replicas. They're not reproductions. They're the real deal. And found out that there was a great story behind that. So you can see, we'll read this last paragraph right here. This account of the great hurricane and its aftermath led up to one crucial point, dramatic and tragic, sudden and sad. In the excitement of the violence of the storm and a house full of dripping refugees, the elderly Miss Wright had a heart attack. She died 2 days later. My means of affable identification of the Edwards family portraits and papers, my providential verifier, was no longer of this world. It was a close call for the Jonathan Edwards College and the Yale Library. This was maybe, 12, 15, 20 pages, somewhere in there. Didn't read every single word, but skimmed through it. And from what I remember reading this, I think the moral of the story is this. Yale found out about the portraits who were in someone's possession. Yale got to them before Princeton did. And if Princeton was able to have gotten to them forgive my grammar. If Princeton was able to get a hold of them first, they would have loved to, because there's where Jonathan's buried. But Yale found out about it first. The guy, it's not in here, but he talked about getting in his station wagon, taking somebody with him, and said, we got to get to this place. We got to talk to these people, because what had happened, they had went to the home of the family, and he said, when I die, y'all can have the portraits, y'all can have the papers. And what happened is, though he said that, he never had his will changed, or never had it added to his will. And so I forget the details now, but between this guy saying, yeah, it's yours, but he never had his will changed, things could have been drastically different. So that was a neat little thing to go through, and that's sitting there in the Jonathan Edwards area of the Stockbridge local history. A few little knickknacks. This little clock here, this little footrest, this little wood sign right there. Those were used from wood that came from the home of Jonathan Edwards that once stood where that sundial was at the beginning of this video. The Yale Works of Jonathan Edwards, when this one was made, Original Sin, Volume 3, cost a whopping $17.50. Today, that same book new costs $125. If only the Yale Works of Jonathan Edwards were still $17 a piece. Though you can read them for free at edwards.yale.edu. The tombstone, the grave marker of Jonathan Edwards, and I don't have it with me, but I can put it maybe in the comments, because I'm not at church. I'm in my building in my backyard. A very gracious guy, Brother Michael at our church, who knows Latin. He translated this for me, and it was neat to see what they put on the grave of Jonathan Edwards. So that's that. If you can read Latin, there it is. Here we are, the Jonathan Edwards house at Stockbridge. See some pictures of it. I was able to read some history about that. From what I remember, one of these deals where the house was falling apart. Time had passed. A lot of time had passed. Needed upkeep. A guy who I think owned the property, he said, Stockbridge, I'm going to tear it down. I'm giving you notice. I'm going to build something here. You saw in the sundial that big fancy white house in the background there. I assume that's what was built when all this took place. Well, Jonathan's house is falling apart. Nobody wants to fool with it. Nobody wants to do anything with it. And so the guy finally says, all right, I've given you enough warning. I'm tearing it down. Well, he tears it down, and what happens? The town gets mad at him for tearing it down. And he told them, I told you I was going to do it. Nobody wanted to do anything with it. But, how cool it would be if this house was still there. Where we could possibly have seen the room where Edwards wrote some of his masterpieces. That would be cool. So there's another shot of it. Okay, right here at the end of the town, zoom in on this for you, near where Main Street borders the cemetery. You can see right here, there's the cemetery, there's Main Street, and where this road curves up to the right of there and up above Main Street is a very big town cemetery. Did not have time to walk through there, but I imagine you could see some people there who were buried during the time where Jonathan ministered. So you've got at the end of Main Street where the city kind of stops. I mean, total 0.4 miles, 0.5 miles, the whole length of the businesses and restaurants and little breakfast and bed and breakfast inn and stuff, sandwich place. Not a very big stretch of road at all. Well, at the end of this road is this huge marker that is maybe 12 foot tall, 13, 14 foot tall, somewhere in there. Yeah, there's a video. All right, Tony Walker, got another video for you. What we have here is a memorial that was built. You see on this side it says Jonathan Edwards, and you go around this way, and you can see that it says Edwards was here in the last few years of his life. And while they were here, I understand that it was built in after they met back memorial. All right, so there's a video for you about that. Background behind that, there was an Edwards family reunion in 1870. They came there. While they were there, they took up money for this monument, this marker, and it was built, I believe, in 1871, 1872, and then in 1870, forgive me, there's a big flock of birds outside my window. I think just left my bird feeder when I spoke up. So the Edwards family meets in 1870, 1871, 72. The marker is built, and then they came back together in 1874 for another family reunion and to see the erected marker, and had another family meeting there, which I believe I'll be able to show you a picture of his family that was together. Point of the story behind that: the guy who owned the sandwich shop in town, he obviously didn't recognize my accent and stuff, and we got to talking, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I told him about Jonathan Edwards, and he said, "You talking about the politician?" I said, "No, not the politician." And he said, "I said, no, there's also a musician named Jonathan Edwards. You see that on eBay, searching for Edwards books and stuff." And I said, "No, he was a pastor. He's a missionary." And I said, "You know that big brown tall marker at the end of Main Street?" He said, "Yeah." I said, that's for Jonathan Edwards. So here's another story where the guy in town, but didn't know the history behind it. So I had a long, friendly conversation with him there at the sandwich shop back behind the museum and library. Right here is where the church would have stood that Edwards pastored in at Stockbridge. Can't really see it, but it says this memorial tower marks the spot where stood the little church in the wilderness in which John Sargent preached to the Stockbridge Indians in 1739. I'm assuming that's going to be the same piece of ground that Edwards would have been in, but I can't remember the exact timeline on the actual church buildings for the Stockbridge Congregational Church. So here we are. John Sargent, pastor number 1, he dies 1749. Jonathan Edwards, 1751. Jonathan Edwards becomes the second pastor at the Congregationalist Church at Stockbridge. This church building stays unlocked, so if you ever make it that way, open the door and you'll be able to walk right in. I don't remember the exact story. I don't know if it's talking about the floor or the pulpit, but supposedly some of the wood that is somewhere in that picture came from either Jonathan's house or the church, the original church and pulpit where Jonathan would have been. For some reason, a guy told me that, or I read that in the library there. I can't remember now. But the guy who worked the evening shift there in the history room of the Stockbridge Library and Museum, this is where he attends church at. Probably one of the most moving things, for whatever reason, it struck me. Here in the church, you can see there's 3 signs over on the left side of the pulpit, and then there's 3 more over on the right side, which are kind of memorials to the first 6 pastors of the church there at Stockbridge. This one right here, just because of the way it put it, shows us kind of the attitude behind Jonathan. How could he accomplish so much? Well, he wasn't really concerned about the limelight or the fame. He just wanted to be faithful, and how much that should challenge all of us. So, in memory of Jonathan Edwards, second pastor of this church, missionary, preacher, philosopher, who while ministering to the humble parish in the wilderness. So he's been voted out of the church where he gave his life, most of his life, Northampton. He's now at this small church that, relatively speaking, if we're basing our service for God on numbers and growth and metrics and things like that, this would look to be a step down. You listen to the church growth gurus and you listen to all these people say, we had 5, you get into all that stuff, and all of us are geared to focus more on numbers than we should probably. Well, how many of us, if we were voted out of a church with roughly, 600 people thereabouts, 230 plus 23, 253, 253 voting men plus wives plus children, um, if you go from that to a church with roughly a dozen, to use the language from the Edwards biographies, about a dozen or so white families, and then the mission to the Indians there. Um, Jonathan, if he had been most of us, if he had been me, he would have gotten so depressed, so discouraged that he would have thrown in the towel. But thankfully, he was dedicated. Um, I'm sure that if he had a choice, he would rather probably minister to several hundred than a smaller number, just for the sake of more souls hearing the word. But whatever went on in his mind during that time, we do know this. He was faithful in little, and in turn, God used that to be faithful in much. Because here, in the humble parish in the wilderness, instead of wasting time, instead of calling it quits, instead of riding out into the sunset, he composed those treatises, excuse me, those great works on the freedom of the will and on original sin, which gave him universal fame. So those treatises on the freedom of the will and on original sin, and we know later, I'm sure it would have been written during that time, the nature of true virtue and the end for which God created the world. Those four things, I've read two of those, and I'm still working on haven't got to the other two yet. Read Freedom of the Will and read the End. Got to get the other two in. There in that humble parish in the wilderness, the little church in the wilderness, that's where Edwards made use of the time he had. And what did God do with it? He wrote a book that, in the introduction to that book, it was said if that's the only book he ever wrote, he would have been known as America's greatest philosopher and theologian. So there, what's the moral of the story? What's the point of that rabbit trail? Tony, don't waste your time complaining about this, that, or the other. This plaque itself is one example of the faithfulness that we should have. All right, so Jonathan, born at East Windsor, October 5th, 1703, came to this church August 9th, 1751, was voted out of Northampton summer of 1750, so a little bit more than about a year and a month later. Dismissed to accept the presidency of the College of New Jersey, what we call Princeton, January 4th, 1758, and died March 22nd, 1758. And on Thursday's video, video number 4, we'll be able to show you the room where Jonathan Edwards passed away. All right, let's see what we got here. Let's keep going. Here's a...
Born in Windsor, Connecticut, to Edwards.
Give you an idea of the church there.
The one thing the church in North of the humble parents would assume, little did he the bride.
All right. When I get time, all these other little smaller videos, I'm going to hopefully get those uploaded one day as well. All right, here's the mission house. It's on some bookmarks and postcards and such. Give you an idea of what that looks like.
This would have been the home where John Sargent, the first pastor of the Church of Northampton, Stockbridge, John Sargent was the first minister here at Stockbridge to the Indians, and Jonathan Edwards.
It's 4:30.
It's closed for tours. Kind of make out a little bit. Assume that,
All right, so there's a little bit about the mission house. Sometimes it's open for different things, but it was not open. A lady who worked in the building back behind there with the local historical societal thing, she said that she was the one who told me that the home actually used to be back further in the woods, and they had it moved here when some property was sold. Was able to, this guy on the left, he was a descendant of, from Baptist history, the name Roger Williams. Can't remember exactly what all he said there, but had a really good conversation with him and another guy who was him. He saw me making the video of the mission house, and he walked up. He said, "Do you know a lot about this house?" I didn't know if he was testing me or what. And I said, "Is this a trick question, trying to see how much I know?" He said, "No, we don't know anything about it, but we saw you with the camera and figured you knew something." And we talked maybe 30, 45 minutes. So that was really encouraging. Um, One thing on this trip that I really do believe it was the Lord's will that I was able to go. Number one, a plane ticket from Atlanta to Boston and Boston back was only $60 total. That was one miracle. And then also during the week, whether it was able to hopefully speak an evangelistic word to some people or leave gospel tracts or whatever, or the other Christians that I met during the week, just random happenstance meetings. It was a good week all around. Okay, I mentioned in 1874 is when the Edwards family got back together to see the finished product for the tall brown marker at the end of Main Street there at the cemetery. Well, here's a picture of the church, which is still the church now, the Congregationalist Church there at Stockbridge. There's the Edwards family. It says, "Gathering and descendants of Jonathan Edwards, Stockbridge, Massachusetts, um, September 1874." So a few more pictures there. All right, and that finishes up the Tuesday, October 31st in Stockbridge. And the next day is going to be spent with the gracious time that was donated by Miss Elise Bernier Feely. She is the local historian at the library there at Northampton and an Edwards fan as well. More like an Edwards walking encyclopedia. So was able to spend pretty much all day Wednesday with her, and that was so gracious of her. So that worked out well. So this ends day 2, Tuesday, October 31st in Stockbridge, and the next video is going to take us to the Forbes Library and surrounding places at Northampton. Trying to add a little spiritual encouragement along the way in each one of those videos. One little closing comment for Stockbridge. One thing that I thought as I finished my day up there, the library was closing. They were ready for me to leave. I think it was 8 o'clock or so when they closed. And I left my vehicle parked at the end of the town where the church was. And so I'm walking back down Stockbridge, walking down the sidewalk there, and in doing so, I passed all the other places I've seen, the mission house, Edwards, where his house stood, the cemetery there, and I come up on the marker. There's the marker in honor and memory of him. There's the church there on the left. And as I'm walking down the sidewalk, heading back to the vehicle, calling it a night, the thought was going through my mind. All of us want to be known. Let me put in a plug here. I guess he may eventually see this video. Mr. Matt Everhard, he's an Edwards scholar. He has, I believe, 4 entries in the new Jonathan Edwards Encyclopedia from Erdman's. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. That just came out. Young pastor, not old at all, still raising a family, but seems to be really doing a great job there. From what I can tell, seeing things about him online. Mr. Matt Everhard wrote a book that is for free under Kindle Unlimited that you can get for Kindle or e-readers or whatever. And it's called Unknown. And I did not get to read all of the book because my unlimited free trial ran out. But when I knew my time was running, I read the first couple of chapters, but when I knew the time was running out, I went ahead and read the last concluding chapter just to see how he finished the book. And he admitted, the same thing that probably many people struggle with. That there's something inside of us that wants to be famous. We want to be known. We want people to remember our name. The honest truth is that most people won't remember our name. That people aren't going to know who me or you are. Most of us, a couple of generations after we die, one generation tops most of us. But does that mean that what we do is in vain or not important? if people aren't writing about us, if people aren't using vacation time from their job to travel, to take pictures of our tombstone and our various things, markers and all, where we were born, and signs on the side of the road. While people may not travel to see the birthplace of Tony Walker 250 years from now, does that mean that what we do, that the Lord doesn't take note of it, that we won't have an influence? Well, the truth of the matter is, A to Z, beginning to end, it all depends on these infinite number of points in between. And while you know A is a famous letter and Z is a famous letter, Q doesn't get a whole lot of attention. It's not used all that often. But the letters next to it do get a lot of attention. Well, that may be a silly example or illustration, but what happens after my life will depend on what I did in my life, and my life depends on what took place before me. Edwards mentioned in Freedom of the Will talks about the chain of events, and how that the view that Edwards is promoting, while it's accused of saying, well, if that's true, then nothing matters, and Edwards says, no, if it is true, everything does definitely matter if this depends on this and this depends on this, if I'm understanding his argument correctly. So, whether or not people remember our name 50 years or 500 years after we're gone should not be our motivation. And Tony Walker needs to repent, if that ever is, and when that is, his motivation. Our job is to be faithful to the Lord and to leave the results in His hands, and for us to not desire success, but to desire to be faithful. Success in a vain way. We should desire to be faithful to the Lord, and if He wants to bless our efforts in a great way, that's His business, that's His doings. If He does not choose to use our labors in a way that is remembered and recognized for 200-300 years later, that's perfectly all right, because none of us deserve to be or are worthy of being used by the Lord anyway. But as I'm walking down that sidewalk, the thought came to mind, people aren't going to probably remember me after I'm gone, but that does not mean that my influence can't outlive my name. So hopefully, all of us, me, you, hopefully we will serve the Lord in such a way that while our name may be forgotten, and our works in name may be forgotten, may the things we did for Christ have such a lasting influence that even if they aren't famous, they will affect people for generations on end. Well, how do we do that? Number one, if you're married, love your wife. If you've got kids, love your kids. Whatever church you're a part of, love the people there. And focus on serving the Lord, being faithful where He has placed you. And I don't know what went on in the mind of Edwards. He may have known that the stuff he was writing was on a level different than most other things, but he may not have known that. I'm sure he was probably a very humble person, more than most of us. But in the humble parish in the wilderness, did he really know that he was going to write one book among many books that people would say, even if you never wrote another book other than that book, referring to Freedom of the Will, people would say you was the greatest theologian ever lived, or at least the greatest American theologian. I doubt he sat in his house there that has been since torn down, spinning that six-sided table around saying, boy, this book is going to make me famous 250 years later, 300 years later, 500 years later. People still going to be reading this book. I'm sure that probably didn't go through his mind. What was his goal? His goal was probably to be faithful and serve the Lord. He wrote the end for which God created the world, God's glory. He was probably focused more on God's glory than his name being remembered. And as a result, his name is remembered and God is glorified. All right, we'll call it quits here. That was day 2 of my Jonathan Edwards trip that marked the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. October 31st, 1517 is when Luther nailed his stuff to the door, assuming he did nail it to a door, or posted it to the door. And 500 years later, I was in a little town with a minister who had just got voted out of a church he had been for more than 2 decades, at the humble parish in the wilderness, who changed Christian history and majorly influenced what many people believe today. So be faithful in little, and in doing so, you will be faithful in much. All right, I'll see you on the next video. That's probably going to be it for today. I'm going to head back to church this evening. But let's see. So this is Monday and Tuesday. We have seen Enfield. We have seen East Windsor, South Windsor. We have seen Wethersfield on Monday. Tuesday was spent all day at Stockbridge, and then we'll move to the next video, day 3 of my Jonathan Edwards tour trip in Northampton, where Jonathan Edwards spent more than 2 decades, a couple of years as an assistant for his grandfather, and then a couple decades as the pastor of the church there at Northampton. All right, please subscribe to the channel. Please save the playlist, and hopefully that'll alert you, and you can receive a notification when the next video is uploaded. All right, take care, and hopefully you'll share these videos with other Edwards fans and scholars. And I hope that the pictures and the background stuff has been a blessing, and hopefully the few little spiritual tidbits I've tried to share has been an encouragement as well. All right, see you next time.